Hey, it's Tom, and today we're going to talk about traditional sculpting versus digital sculpting. I've been sculpting miniatures since 2002. For the majority of that time, I've used traditional methods and techniques. Sure, there were different materials, and if you've followed along with my sculpting archives, you'll see that I've tried a variety of mediums over the years. But really, putties and clays were the only option. And they were great! To this day, I still count some of my traditional sculpts in my top 10 favorites. Recently, I've been frequently asked how I feel about traditional versus digital sculpting. Which is better? Should I sculpt traditionally or digitally? Will you ever go digital? I always enjoy the last question. And why, you might ask? Because I sculpted my first digital miniature using ZBrush back in 2016. Yeah, that's right. It was the City of Farronrock for the Myth Dark Frontier board game. Well, since then, I've sculpted a handful of traditional miniatures. Yes, an actual handful. They are minis after all. But in the last 3 years, every miniature I've sculpted with the exception of 2 has been digital. As someone who started sculpting as a traditional sculptor, it's very rewarding to find out that very few notice the transition. So, how do I feel about traditional versus digital sculpting? When I first started thinking about how to approach this topic, I put together a list of pros and cons to try and compare and ultimately show which was better. But as the list grew, it became increasingly clear that many of the pros and cons could easily be argued as the opposite given the right circumstances. So rather than give you a list of pros and cons to set traditional and digital sculpting against each other, I've decided to cover the key distinctions so you can determine which medium will work best for you. So what do you need to get started with traditional or digital sculpting? Well, for traditional, it's pretty easy. You only need a few things. You need some putty or clay, whatever you decide to work with. And frankly, you can get by with just a knife, like an X-Acto knife. You can sculpt pretty much anything with just that. Obviously, we don't, and you usually want to have a few more things to make it a little easier to sculpt various elements. But if you just wanted to upgrade a little bit more, all you really, like a real basic toolkit, is to have an X-Acto knife and or a scalpel, a pin, a needle tool like that, and then some sort of large burnisher and a small burnisher, just a small spoon-shaped tool of different sizes so you can manipulate large areas of clay or putty or small areas. And this is kind of a luxury, but color shapers are really great when working with putty and clay as well, just to have a softer touch when you're trying to manipulate the material. And how much does that all cost? Probably $50 tops. Less if you're willing to make some of the tools yourself with found objects. So from that aspect, traditional sculpting is very easy to get started with. Now, to sculpt digital, on the other hand, you need a few more things. You need a computer, you need a drawing tablet or tablet monitor, you need the software, and you have to keep that software and equipment up to date as you go. Fortunately, many of us have computers already. Now, whether they're good enough to utilize the software like ZBrush and all the computing power needed to do the things you're going to want to do while you're digitally sculpting, that's another matter. And you may already have a tablet. You may have all this stuff. And if that's the case, then you're kind of set and ready to go. But if not, the cost will vary, but you're looking at a minimum of $1,000 to get into this. And depending on the system you want to sculpt with and some of the peripherals you need, like the software or the tablets, you could be looking at $2,000 to $3,000 to have a full setup to really get into digital sculpting. I used to see a lot of beginning sculptors ask me how they can get putty cheaper or in smaller amounts because a $20 tube of green stuff was just so expensive, even though that tube could make them 20 miniatures. That's a lot. When you compare that to the cost of setting up for digital sculpting, it's very drastic and it really puts things in perspective. And you should use that as a guide to help determine if you want to get started in traditional or digital sculpting, because cost is a huge factor. Now you know what it costs to get started with traditional or digital sculpting. Let's talk about the next major hurdle with both of these, and that's going to be the learning curve. Both traditional and digital take time, but what you have to develop and the specific challenges are slightly different for both. With traditional, you're going to have to learn to sculpt with multiple mediums. You're going to learn putty, like green stuff or Procreate, and if you're like me, you're going to want to learn to use clay because it's a really great material as well. And both of those, all of those, are slightly different. And there's many other kinds as well. There's Aves. All of those take a little bit of time to learn the particulars about sculpting with those mediums. But the bigger challenge is actually going to be building up your muscle memory and developing what a lot of sculptors call having the touch. A very fine control of your hand with the tool to be able to do fine manipulations with the putty or clay. And it's especially challenging to do this with putty because it's very sticky and you have to deal with the time it takes of the material to cure and how it's changing as you're sculpting. Digital has some of those same challenges as traditional. You do still have to, obviously with both, you have to learn to sculpt. If you don't know how to sculpt, that's a whole nother matter. But we're just focusing on the actual mediums of traditional versus digital. My friend and fellow sculptor Bobby Jackson really helped me a lot in my journey on digital when he taught me to think of the material in ZBrush as digital clay. And so just like traditional, you have to learn the kind of ins and outs and what you can do with various resolutions of the material. But in the end, you kind of treat it very similar. However, even though that aspect of sculpting digitally is comparable to traditional, there are some other hurdles that you need to get over in the learning curve when you're sculpting digital. And that's actually building up the technical skills needed to sculpt digitally. This is kind of the same as the issues you have when you were trying to actually get the setup to be able to sculpt, buying the computer and the tablet. Same thing. If you are not super computer savvy, you're going to have to learn things about computers. Even if you are computer savvy, you have to learn a sculpting software like ZBrush or Blender. And that's no small feat. There are primers out there that will teach you how to use the software in the very basic level, and you can probably start sculpting fairly quickly. But to really understand the whole program and everything that you can do with it and need to do with it takes quite a lot of time and a lot of tutorials. Whereas with traditional, again, it's helpful to be taught, but there's nothing standing in your way. All you really have to do is put in time on the material and you'll get better at sculpting. With digital, you have got to learn the fundamentals of the software at the very base level, and then you're going to have to learn advanced techniques in order to output something that is actually usable. I'll give you an example. Let's take two new sculptors who want to sculpt a goblin. The first sculptor is going to do traditional and the other will do digital. The traditional sculptor gets the material, tools, and sculpts a figure. Let's forget whether it's actually good or not in this case for either person. But the person sculpts the goblin to completion in their material, and it is done. They have a complete miniature. It can be molded. It can be cast, or they can just paint it up with the material they have in hand. Now let's look at the digital sculptor. We'll assume that they're kind of at the same level as the traditional. They're very early in sculpting. They know how to use the program at a base level so they can actually sculpt something. Well, you can do that. And I've actually seen many sculptors get started and show more proficient sculpts early on with digital than traditional. However, There are many, many technical pitfalls that you will come into, or things you don't know how to execute, because a lot of functions and things you need to do to create a finished 3D print or making a sculpture that can be a digital asset in a game, all those things require additional technical knowledge that can take significantly more time for you to figure out. I mean, when you figure it out, it's great and you can put it all out there. But my point is, go into this knowing that you're going to have some significant study and challenges to overcome in digital that you do not have with traditional. In this last section, I wanted to cover some of the technical aspects of going down these two sculpting paths. The first topic is sculpting for miniatures. And yes, while you may be able to sculpt, you do need to take certain things into account when you're sculpting for miniatures. When you're sculpting at such a small size, you need to take into account the size and proportion of things, whether elements and features of the face or the thickness of a weapon are going to be large enough to one, be paintable, or two, hold up to the rigors of playing miniature games with. And when you're sculpting traditionally, you inherently get a sense and know that something is the right size and will work. I mean, clearly, if you've never done it before, you could make something that's way too thin to cast properly as a metal or plastic miniature and hold up to actual use. But you're going to physically know and be able to see that it's thin. When you're working digitally, it's a lot harder to learn that and understand that, because you end up being able to blow these things up sometimes 10 times larger than they are going to be when they're a physical item. You shouldn't let that scare you off from digital sculpting, but it is a serious concern and something that you will have to work at in order to make sure that your miniatures work as miniatures. Continuing on from that point, I want to talk a little bit about production of miniatures. So, if you make a traditional sculpture, you have one copy of that miniature, but it is ready to be molded. You just send it to the mold maker, mold it yourself. It can be cast, and you can sell metal miniatures, plastic miniatures, whatever, resin, whatever material you want to work in. If you're sculpting digitally, you first have to pay to have it print, and there's a cost to that. And with a lot of companies, it can be up to $100, if not more, depending on who's doing it and the quality of printer they're using. But on the plus side, if you make a digital sculpt, you have as many as you want. If something happens to the original sculpture, in the case of a traditional, you just make another one. It's no big deal. Obviously, there's a cost, but it's not like you have to worry about it getting lost in shipping if you were to send an original sculpt in the mail. And of course, you may have no intention of producing your miniatures as a physical product, at least through traditional production. In that case, you might just want to create something and sell digital files, STLs. And in that case, digital is clearly the best route. So, which type of sculpting is best for you? That's hard for me to answer, and that's why I made the video the way I did. I wanted to present various aspects to help guide you in your choice. Because frankly, in the end, there's a lot of personal preference. You can have a great career or a great hobby sculpting in either way. I do want to leave you with one last thought when making your decision to do traditional or digital sculpting. If you're going to be an amateur or hobbyist, then it really is up to you. It comes down to your personal skill sets and what you're willing to pay to afford as far as equipment, and your drive to learn, software or just take a more artisan approach and do it by hand with clay. But if you want to work as a professional, especially somebody who is a freelancer or working directly with companies, I would definitely recommend looking into digital sculpting. While you can always do your own thing with traditional sculpts, and there are several places still looking to work with people who sculpt physical miniatures, the vast majority of companies are looking for digital artists, and I've seen that scale tip massively in just the last 3 years alone. You're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table if that's the sort of path you want to pursue. Well, there you go. I hope that helped you make a decision of which is right for you, traditional or digital sculpting. And whether you've been sculpting for a while or if you're just getting started, I'd love to hear if you have a preference, so go ahead and leave a comment down below. But no matter which path you choose, remember, keep sculpting.